The title of my sermon this morning is one I've never used before. Not the future we ordered. Honoring our grief. And in the 15 years that Connie and I have lived on the road, traveling all over North America, we've spoken to about 500 Unitarian churches, spoken also in hundreds of other kinds of religious and secular audiences, about 2,200 groups. I've never spoken on a Sunday morning on a stool. I'm doing this purposely, and I'm sure I'll get up, but I'm doing this because this is a heavy topic. This is a more sobering topic, and I don't want to be too intense, as I sometimes can be. So I have 3 points. Every sermon's supposed to have 3 points, right? So I got 3 points that I'd like to share, that I'd like to go into. The first is understanding our predicament. The second is about honoring our grief, the 6 faces or facets of grief. And the third is, okay, now what? What do we do? Where do we go? So to speak about understanding our predicament is first of all to recognize that there is a profound difference between a problem that can be potentially solved and a predicament which can't. See, we're used to thinking in terms of problems because for the last 200 years we've had a lot of energy. And if we just threw enough energy and human ingenuity at things, we could solve many problems. So we're used to thinking of almost everything in terms of a problem that can be solved, or at least potentially be solved. And yet, throughout the course of evolution, most things that humans have had to deal with, and other animals as well, and plants too for that matter, are not problems that can be solved. They're predicaments that you have to live with, you have to adapt to, you have to evolve with. And so it's important to understand the difference between a problem and a predicament. It's kind of like that old prayer that you find in 12-step recovery, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Well, you don't have to believe in anything otherworldly to basically say that there are some things that we can change. Those things may be problems that can be solved. There are things that we can't change. Those are predicaments we're going to have to deal with and adapt to and live with. And then, of course, being able to discern that's really important. So, first of all, the big picture is vital. Without an understanding of the history of everyone and everything, physical evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution, as our first and only globally produced evidence-based creation story, if that's not the foundation of our relationship to reality, then we're going to have an inadequate understanding of the nature of reality, so we're going to have a very skewed understanding of what's important. Because these are the two questions: what's real, or how things are, and what's important, or which things matter. Those are the two questions that every society needs to address, and we have to address those now. So one of the things that we learn is that we're not separate from nature. We're not separate from the universe. As I shared with the children, the universe began 14 billion years ago, and it's been expanding and becoming more complex. And then in this solar system, the universe became complex enough that it could begin to contemplate itself. And that's who we are. It may be happening many other places. This is not human-centeredness, but we are an aspect of the universe that has begun to contemplate its own nature. We are nature, uncovering its own nature. We're the process learning the nature of the process. So that can give us a sense of guidance, this big picture. One of the things we also understand from a big picture understanding of human history is that we're a rather small part of this process. If you compress the whole history of everyone and everything into 100 years, like if you make 14 billion years equals 100 years, just so that we can get our heads around it, our solar system forms at 70, 67 actually. Earth cools below the boiling point of water at 69 on a 100-year time scale. At 70, Earth comes alive, and at 71, some of the bacteria start feeding on the photons of the sun. photosynthesis. And then you get the long period of evolution. Dinosaurs don't emerge until May of 98, and they die out with the asteroid in July of 99. And human beings show up, if you want to use mythic language, when the goddess or God created us, or scientific language, when we emerge out of the body of life, on December 25th of the 99th year. We domesticated fire on December 29th, and we've only been speaking in words, symbolic language, the last day, December 31st of the 99th year. You got 99 years, 364 days, the last day of a 100-year process is when we, Homo sapiens. Now, Homo sapiens is a rather arrogant way to refer to ourselves, the wise human, because the jury's still out on that one. And in fact, one of the things that we know that we learn about this last day is that from the beginning of December 31st until 11:20 p.m., talking about 98% of the last day, we lived as hunter-gatherers. We lived in tribal groups of 150 or less, and we lived in right relationship to primary reality. That is the air, the water, the soil, and the life upon which we depend. And we attended first and foremost not to human-centered concerns, but to life-centered concerns. In other words, we attended first and foremost to the well-being of the forests that we relied on, the soil we relied on, the animals that we relied on. Now, we didn't do so perfectly. When human beings first showed up in Cuba or Madagascar or North America, wherever human beings showed up with the ability to kill at a distance with a spear, and the animals didn't co-evolve to know to run from this little primate that could kill at a distance, all the big mammals go out. So I'm not lifting up and saying that ancient peoples lived in a perfect, harmonious balance with the natural world. But they also were quick to discover when they didn't, they suffered. We also learn from big history that there are 24, in this last, from 11:20 p.m. until now, midnight, right? During those last 40 minutes on a 100-year time scale, we know from 11:30 till now, basically, till, right at midnight, there are 24 previous complex civilizations that have become great, and then their own greatness, and they get full of themselves, their own hubris and arrogance becomes their own undoing, and then there's a decline, and then there's a dark age. And then another civilization becomes great, and its own greatness becomes its own undoing, and there's a decline. And typically it takes somewhere between 200 and 800 years for civilizations to become great, and it takes typically 1 to 2 centuries, sometimes 3 centuries, for them to fall. And they all fall pretty much the same way. They overextend what they can afford to maintain, they denude the forests, they don't attend to the topsoil, it all washes away, the civilization collapses. But we talk about collapse as if it's like this. It's actually not. The collapse of the Roman Empire took 325 years. It was a slow stair step. It's what John Michael Greer, who I actually got the title of this sermon, Not the Future We Ordered, is one of his books. But another one of his books is called The Long Descent. It's a stair step, and they're partial recoveries. That's the way virtually every civilization of these previous 24 have contracted and collapsed over decades and often a century or two. And we are well into that process. We are 40 years into catabolic collapse. Let me say one more thing about this predicament that we're in, is that when human beings, Europeans, had saturated Europe, Europe was beginning to experience population pressure. We were denuding the forests, we were degrading the soil, the animals we were wiping out because it was too many people. And then an entire new hemisphere was discovered. And because our bugs, our germs went ahead of most of us, wiped out 90% of the North and South Americans, it looked like, from the European perspective, that this was an uninhabited continent. Timber, animals, and then minerals, and then finally oil and coal and natural gas. We had this sense of limitlessness. And we know from science that any species, not just humans, any species that is all of a sudden, in an unexpected way, opened up to a new habitat that it didn't have access to before that's conducive, the population skyrockets and life is good. When you measure the hormones of other creatures, there's this sense of elation, this sense of just life is great. The predicament that we're in is that I say we, Americans, right? However we got here, and some of us got here through slavery, right? But however we got here, we, for the last 200 years, have had this expectation of limitlessness, this expectation that anything is possible. And so our institutions and our mindset were formed in a world of carrying capacity surplus. See, the other thing that we learn about this great story, this epic of evolution, is that limits are real. And if we don't treat limits as sacred, we will suffer. Just to tell you just a personal story, I spent much of the last 15 years, certainly up until about 2012, preaching a gospel that was very linear, this understanding that from the caves to now to the stars, there was this sense of even what I was sharing, what Connie and I shared for the first 10 years, was much more of a linear understanding. I didn't understand about the rise and fall of civilizations. I didn't get that. I thought it was just hunter-gatherers, and then agricultural revolution, and then industrialism, and here we are, and it's like, whoa, Star Trek future. I didn't understand limits. I didn't understand that there's a limit to how many resources we can take from a bioregion or a planet or a continent, and a limit to how much waste we can exude before the system starts breaking down. See, to live sustainably is to live indefinitely without diminishing or destroying primary reality. It's having an honorable, respectful, healthy relationship to primary reality. Whether we use mythic names or secular names for primary reality, it doesn't matter. And so limits are real. There's a limit to human nature. We didn't know that. We thought that our intelligence was limitless, that we were going to understand everything about everything. In fact, there were books that were written 100 years ago talking about the end of science, the end of knowledge. We were going to know everything about everything. And there's a limit to how much we can pay attention to. And the advertising industry and politicians, even those who deny evolution, play on our evolutionary instincts. We are evolutionarily programmed to pay attention to certain things and ignore other things. And so most of us, if we watch the news, if we listen to the radio, watch television, just drive anywhere, we are bombarded with images that we're programmed to pay attention to. So there's a limit to human nature. There are limits. So my point is that there are limits that if we don't honor them as sacred, we then suffer. One more thing about this predicament is that living in a carrying capacity surplus world and living in a carrying capacity deficit world, that is where we no longer have enough resources for 7.5 billion people, much less 8 or 9. The Earth can no longer afford to absorb our toxicity. We are already well into think about it, that's what climate change is. Climate change is a dishonoring of the limits of the atmosphere to absorb our CO2. And now there's going to be punishing consequences for us. Some of that's unavoidable. Some of it is still that we can make a difference. We no longer have, to use a religious metaphor, we no longer have a choice of whether we experience purgatory or not. That's inevitable. We can't avoid purgatory. We can still avoid hell. And again, I'm not speaking about anything otherworldly. Okay? So, understanding our predicament is to understand that we are in the last decade or two of the American empire where 5% of the world's population basically take 25 to 30% of the world's energy and material resources for the benefit of the 5%. We're within the last decade or two of that going bye-bye. And we're in the last century or two of industrialism, where industrialism continues to contract, every decade being a little bit harder, a little bit worse than the previous one. But it's not collapsed like this, although we could experience some triggering tipping points in terms of climate. There are some unpredictable factors in the system. In fact, it's possible that there may not even be humans 200 years from now. We could trigger that bad. I don't think we will. In fact, I've spent a lot of time in the last, coming back to sort of my personal testimonial, the last 4 years I've been studying the rise and fall of civilizations. I've been studying what our best scholarship, scientific, historic, and cross-cultural evidence tells us about the nature of this. And there's something, when you can really accept what's inevitable, it's amazing the peace that one can have. So this moves me to my second point, which is to honor the 6 faces or the 6 facets of grief. Because if you're not experiencing what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross called the stages of grief, they're not exactly stages because you don't always move through it one at a time, right? 6 stages, or however you want to look at it. You sometimes cycle back around, you cycle back around. Denial is the first one, and most people are still in denial. There's not a problem here. America can continue as we are. Things are going to keep getting better and better and easier and wealthier and wealthier. Now, I must say this. The last election has thrown a monkey wrench for many of us who are on the more liberal and progressive side of things. We no longer effortlessly believe that everything's just keeping getting better and better. In fact, I had a friend who said, like, why aren't you more upset by the last election? And it was interesting. The question sort of caught me off guard, but my response was quite simple, which is that I believe that the number one enemy of the future, if I could be so ridiculous as to frame it that way, the number one enemy of the future is the techno-narcissistic religion of growth everlasting. This idea that technology is going to continue to allow us to dominate nature, to control nature, and that this sense of that everything can grow. Population can grow, resource exploitation can grow, the economy can grow, everything's growth. The religion of growth everlasting. That is the number one enemy of the future. And the sooner that hits the brick wall of reality, the better. And it seems to me quite likely that under the current administration, given the fact that all the levers of power are in the control of one party, that we're more likely to hit that brick wall of reality than had Hillary Clinton won, where most progressives and liberals would have still been able to be in the myth of perpetual progress. Hey, we had a black president for 8 years. We've now got a female president. Gays can get married. Of course, things are getting better and better and better. So to honor the stages of grief, denial is the first one. To honor that. And some of your friends and family are in denial. But to have compassion for ourselves and others. Denial is a normal, healthy stage. Most people don't stay there forever, but we all have been there, and we all may cycle back there again. Anger. When we break through the denial, often anger. And we find somebody to blame and judge. It's those oil company executives. It's that other political party. It's these individuals, and everybody's blaming. It's the scapegoat phenomenon, and the anger is there. And to honor the anger isn't necessarily to make right our various judgments about that, but it's to honor that anger is a normal, healthy part of the grieving process. In fact, it's inevitable to feel at least some of that. The next is bargaining. Like when we get through, or at least through some of the anger, then it's like, well, we'll be able to technologically suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And robots, humans may suck, we may really screw things up, but robots, if we just get smart enough computers and robots, then they'll take over for us. Or the economy, all the different magical beliefs that have, it's a form of bargaining. It's a form of not fully accepting that we're in a normal, natural, healthy, inevitable process of the decline of a civilization. And that we are also planting the seeds for healthy forms of religiosity, healthy forms of culture, healthy forms of everything on the other side. Because not only are we at the end of peak human-centeredness, you probably heard of peak oil, peak energy, peak benefits. See, one of the other things that a lot of people are not aware of in terms of our predicament is that many people have this understanding that wind and solar and geothermal and all the renewable energies are going to continue to allow us to live in this wasteful way we've been living. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Yes, the future is absolutely renewable energy, but it's not going to allow us to live at the kind of wasteful lifestyles that we have gotten very used to because we had cheap, concentrated energy. And that's a good thing. People sometimes try to fit me in a box. They say, well, okay, you're clearly not on the techno-optimist, this myth of perpetual progress, but it sounds sort of apocalyptic. Are you one of these doom and gloomers? And I love this. I got from a 35-year-old woman in Australia this understanding of, I'm an apocalyptimist. An apocalyptimist is a life-centered perspective. It's a biocentric, ecocentric perspective. It's not human-centered. So from a human-centered perspective, we are so screwed. But from a life-centered perspective, whoa, there's possibility because we've been in a several thousand-year period of human-centeredness. City-based civilizations typically overshoot the carrying capacity, diminish and destroy the natural world. And we're at the peak of that. So we're now in a process where I think, personally, I believe human beings will survive. And we will survive probably for thousands, maybe even another 1 or 2 years before an asteroid or supervolcano or something takes us out. And Connie's been saying for years that even if worst case scenario, like if we destroy ourselves and take many other species down with us, her money is on raccoons to be the next self-reflexive intelligence. That is the next creature to come to know that it knows, right? And so life will go on. So let me begin winding this down. Understanding our predicament is vital. We are in decline, and decline is not the same. A world of carrying capacity deficit, which is what we actually live in, is not the same as a carrying capacity surplus. Said in another way, how we think and act in an expanding economy is not the same way that we think and act in ways that are healthy in a contracting economy. And we are looking at everything contracting over a period of decades and, in fact, a couple centuries. I'm a short-term pessimist, but I'm a long-term optimist because when I look out longer term, I'm actually hopeful. I believe that we are in the great reckoning. Humanity has been out of right relationship to reality. And we are now about to experience consequences of biblical proportion. That's the bad news. The good news is that I also believe this is the great homecoming. The prodigal species, after squandering our inheritance, we're waking up to our predicament, in the pig pen as it were, and coming home to reality. Whether you use divine or secular names for reality, it doesn't matter. We're coming home to reality. We're being forced to come home to reality. Let me finish the stages of grief, because this leads to the now what? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression. Depression is healthy. It's normal. A friend of mine who's an ecologically oriented evangelical minister, Brian McLaren, says if you haven't been tempted to serious despair over climate change, you don't get it. But if you wallow in the despair, then you're just part of the problem. It's honoring the depression, honoring the sadness, honoring the grief, honoring the tears. And then finally coming to acceptance that then leads to being in action. To what Joanna Macy, my mentor, calls active hope. It's not Pollyanna, it's not pie in the sky, it's not otherworldly, it's active hope. I mentioned that for 10 years I was a techno-optimist. I had this linear understanding of evolution and a linear understanding of human history. What happened was on December 3rd of 2012, I woke up in the morning and I was looking at something on news, and there was this article, I think it was in the Atlantic. It was called 5 Climate Charts That Should Have You Really, Really Scared. I clicked on it. It was a chart and a paragraph description, a chart, a paragraph description. The last part was a TED Talk by David Roberts, TEDx talk by David Roberts called Climate Change is Simple. I watched it. I was brought to tears. I woke Connie up. I said, we got to watch this together. We both watched it. We were both in tears. That afternoon, we ordered Bill McKibben, James Hansen, Al Gore. We ordered a whole bunch of books on climate change. And climate went from being a back burner issue to a front burner issue. And I've probably spent at least 30 hours a week for the last 4 years studying climate change, sustainability. I've recorded about 1,000 hours of the best audios, all for free, that's available. If you just put Grace Limits Audios in Google, you'll get my page of all these free audios if you like to listen to books rather than just read them. And so I have grieved, I have cried, I have been angry. I cycle back through the stages of grief or the facets of grief. It's normal and natural and healthy to do that. That's why it's important to have compassion for ourselves and our family members and our neighbors and others, because we're all in this together. Connie sometimes says, we're all circling the drain. We're in a declining civilization, a declining time, a contracting time. And many of the things that we've been doing, so this is the final point, is what do we do now? To find those places where what lights you up, what gives you joy, what gives you energy. Like I sometimes encourage people to make a list and draw a line down the middle. So you've got two columns, and on one side list all the things that light you up, give you joy, give you energy, things that you're good at, the things that other people tell you that you're good at, etc. List it all. The top of that list, you put my great joy. Then on the right-hand side, list all the things that you're aware of in your community or the world where you feel the world's needs, where you feel the future's needs, and list all that. And I'm not talking about just what you intellectually know, but where does it hit you? Where do you feel anger and frustration and compassion? And list all that. So you've got your great joy, my great joy, and the world's great needs. And then you just pay attention to your heart. You don't have to call it prayer or meditation if you don't want. Just pay attention to this part of your body. You're trying to get guidance from here. Where are the intersections between what lights you up, what gives you joy, what gives you energy, and what the world's needs are or your community's needs as you feel them? And where your joy and the world's needs, or your joy and the future's needs, where those intersect, that's your calling. That's your mission. That's your vocation. And you can redo this every 5 years or so. I encourage you to do it. But it's that place of, especially when you do it with others, when you work with others and help them. In fact, if you do this with somebody who trusts you and knows you, they're going to help you see intersections on your list that you'll miss. Because what you're trying to do is play mix and match. So that's where we get active and find something that you can do on behalf of life. Because when we do one thing on behalf of life, we are given energy. Even if we know that it's just a drop in the bucket. There are systemic things we can all get involved in terms of changing some of the laws, putting a price on carbon, for example, if there's anybody from Citizens Climate Lobby, but also the individual things that we can do. Yes, it's not going to change everything. Yes, we're still going to be contracting, but it nourishes your soul to just do something on behalf of life. So again, adopt the big picture. Recognize that we're in a predicament, not just a problem that can be solved. Honor the various phases, the stages of grief, and then find where your joy and the world's needs intersect. It may be what you're already doing, but you do it from a place. See, here's the thing. When you understand this apocalyptimist perspective, then when things like the current election or other crazy, insane, stupid stuff that's happening in the world, it's like, oh my God, how can this happen, right? Locally, nationally, statewide, all kinds of crazy stuff. Instead of going, oh no, this shouldn't be, you'll go, oh right, I've been expecting you, come on in. There's this sense of welcoming spirit, a generosity of soul that you can have when you understand that we're in a decline, not an expansion, and the big picture matters, getting that we're in a predicament and we're not dealing with just problems that can be solved. Understanding contraction, understanding that the stages of grief are healthy and normal, and we can have compassion for ourselves and each other, and then finding where your joy and the world's needs intersect. I'll conclude on this note. You will make a bigger difference than you can possibly know, even if you just do little things. Imagine, for example, that you only make a life-changing difference with 3 people. Now, the truth of the matter is you'll make a difference with dozens, maybe hundreds of people, maybe thousands. But let's just pretend you only make a significant difference with 3 people. And then they go on to make a significant difference with only 3 people. But one of them goes on to make a significant difference with 30 million people who wouldn't have been impacted positively had you not made your little difference over here. And the good news is it's not just your good works that will make a difference. Haven't there been people in your life who have made a profound positive difference in your life because of their lousy example? They were a total jerk, And yet you made some positive choice as a result, right? Now, do you honestly think that you haven't been blessing others the same way? So again, ground yourself in the big picture. Know that we're in a predicament, not a problem. Honor the stages of grief and find the places where your joy and the world's needs intersect. And know that even your mess-ups can be a blessing to others.